Welcome to our fireside chat in celebration of World Oceans Day. World Oceans Day is a global event that is celebrated annually on June 8th, and this year's theme is Innovation for a Sustainable Ocean. Today, Neil Davé, the General Manager of Tidal, a team at X whose mission is to protect our ocean while feeding humanity sustainably, is hosting Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson in a conversation about the many facets of innovating for our oceans. From understanding the challenges facing our oceans to how technology can play a role in helping to solve some of those challenges, along with the critical role that people, communities, and governments play in finding lasting solutions. Dr. Ayana Elizabeth Johnson is founder and CEO of Ocean Collective, a strategy consulting firm for conservation solutions grounded in social justice, and founder of Urban Ocean Lab, a think tank for the future of coastal cities. She was recently described as the most influential marine biologist of our time. And just to give you a hint of her work, she co-created the Blue New Deal, which was a roadmap for including the ocean and climate policy, and led the Caribbean's first successful island-wide ocean zoning effort, which resulted in the protection of 1/3 of Barbuda's coastal waters, while she was executive director of the Waite Institute. Thank you all so much for joining us. We'll have about 20 minutes at the end of the conversation between Neil and Ayana to go over questions, so please do go ahead and enter your questions in the dory. Without further ado, I will now hand it over to Neil so we can get started.
Thanks, Kyla. Hi, Ayana. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. I've been looking forward to chatting with you because you have a very unique perspective on addressing ocean health and climate change, and I believe we can all learn from that. Maybe it would be helpful to take a few minutes to tell us about your background and explain how you fell in love with the ocean in the first place.
I think the ocean's a really easy thing to fall in love with. A lot of people who have, a positive experience at the beach, on the shore, as a kid, in an aquarium, have the same reaction that I did, which is like, how can this be my job? Okay, that's called marine biologist. Sign me up. And I think a lot of people sort of lose touch with their childhood dreams. They're told they're naive or irrational, which is so sad. But I really held on to that. I think the reason that I ended up really committing to a career in ocean conservation, though, is because I realized that it could be more than just the biology part. I realized that ocean conservation more broadly is about science and policy and sociology and economics and the crazy puzzle we have to solve amongst all of those disciplines and areas of expertise in order to actually see the conservation benefits that we need. So I've never done a laboratory experiment in my life. The one time I held a pipette, I made someone take a picture. That was not at all my thing. I was just enamored with being in the water, understanding how ecosystems work and species interact, and had this moment of realization when I was doing research in Curacao in the Caribbean that I actually needed to understand people better in order to do ocean conservation. So it was the moment that I switched from counting fish and scuba diving to interviewing fishermen and thinking about policy. That's the reason that I'm still doing this, because that drive to preserve not just ecosystems, but livelihoods and coastal cultures is what I'm the most passionate about.
That's an amazing story. It sounds like you've had a wonderful kind of transition or evolution of the way that you approached the space and kind of what you're working on now. I understand your mission used to be figuring out how to use the ocean without using it up, but you've recently evolved that to building community around climate solutions, which I absolutely love. What were some of the aha moments that led you to evolve your mission in this way?
Well, the first one, this idea of using the ocean without using it up, came from working in Barbuda and realizing that the term sustainability was totally meaningless to most people on the planet. Like, what is sustainability? And like, should that even be the goal, right? Like, to just sustain things when they're already so degraded, we need to protect and restore and re-envision and innovate and all these other things that aren't just like, let's keep this like low level, mostly dead thing going. And so for communities that are really dependent on ocean resources, this idea of like, don't worry, like I'm not some outsider trying to come in and telling you not to use your ocean, but how can we help you figure out a way to use it so that there's still something left for you and for future generations? So that's where that originated from. And through the course of that work, obviously I had always been aware that climate change was the context within which I was trying to do ocean conservation, but I honestly just tried to ignore it because it's so overwhelming that I was just like, yes, we need to deal with climate change, but there's all these other things that we can do locally that make a difference while someone else figures that out. So yes, making sure you're not overfishing and not having pollution locally, that you have good management in place, that you have marine protected areas, all of these things. I thought, well, I can help with that at a local level in different Caribbean islands, or I've worked for the US government on policy too. And so that was how I was focusing. And then I realized that like, that's a little bit ridiculous to just be like, someone else will handle it, because clearly like no one else, a lot of people are working on it, but it's not handled. And so the moment, I guess the real aha moment, there were two of them. One was deciding to work in Barbuda, which is an island essentially at sea level, and realizing that if we got it right, the best, most comprehensive and visionary ocean policy that's fully supported by the community and fully implemented, that island could still be underwater within my lifetime. That the warming of the waters and the acidifying of the waters meant that those coral reefs would be gone no matter what the people who lived there did, right? They could maybe buy some time, but that's not enough. And the second aha moment was when Hurricane Irma hit Barbuda, and Barbuda was actually in the eye of the storm. I remember seeing the map, and they lost all communication with the outside world for like 48 hours. And I was just sitting on my couch crying, not knowing like if this island and these people that I'd come to care so deeply about were going to be okay. Like we just didn't know. And just thinking, well, like we know that these storms are stronger and more damaging because of climate change. We know that warm oceans are basically hurricane food, right? And as my favorite climate scientist, Kate Marvel, always says over at NASA, she's like, it's just hurricane food. And so we're feeding these hurricanes. They're more and more dangerous. And that was sort of the final thing where I was like, I need to broaden the scope of my work. And I'm not going to be the one doing the science about the intricacies of ocean and climate interactions and projections, but I can help other people understand what's at stake and what we can do based on that science.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think it's really important to understand that it's going to take more than just one set of parties to kind of help move things forward. It's really going to be a community effort and an ecosystem effort from all of the actors that play a role in this. So very, very important. I want to stick with the community aspect for a moment here, because I think it's really important to discuss this, especially in this moment. So ocean health is an urgent issue that has serious implications for humanity. I think we can all agree on that. We need to take action on issues like this now. However, at the same time, we're sitting in a moment of major social unrest, from racial injustice that has led to protests around the country and now the world, to COVID, which has had a disproportionate impact on people of color. There's so many challenges facing us, and I'm personally finding it very hard to stay focused on the long road ahead, because right now I need to make sure that my friends, my family, my colleagues, and even myself are physically and mentally okay. Mm-hmm. So how do we as people of color and our allies stay focused on the work we set out to do, or even gain a new perspective of it during this time?
I think one way to consider it is to just say, it's okay that I can't focus right now, and I'm more concerned about the well-being of the people that I love. I think as, you know, as like high achieving intellectuals, we want to be robots who can power through anything, but that's crazy. In this moment, we have to remember our humanity. And so I honestly haven't been that productive in the last week in the traditional professional sense of productive. I've been thinking about what this means for me, for my work, for my community, the fact that we live in a country where I often don't feel safe, including, you know, enjoying nature or being on back roads upstate New York with near my mother's farm, where I see Confederate flags all around me. And I'm more scared of like the white teenagers in pickup trucks with Confederate flags on them than I am of like black bears. Like, this is the context within which I'm trying to focus on writing. And so I guess I would say that I think the racism that is part of the foundation of this country is at best a distraction, right? Like, it's just so hard to focus when we have to deal with all these other things. There's actually a Toni Morrison quote that I was reminded of this past weekend. She said this at a speech in 1975, that the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. And so that's how I feel in this moment. Is it reminds me, because I'm so distracted, it reminds me of the fact that we can't address climate change or ocean conservation fully when you have millions of Americans who feel unsafe and can't focus because there are these other more pressing needs. And in particular, I did the math this weekend because there's great polling out of the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication that over the last 10 or 15 years, they've done polling on like what is the public perception of climate, and they have that broken down on various demographic variables, and one of them is race. And they've consistently shown that people of color actually are much more concerned about climate change than white people. So the numbers on that are 49% of white people are concerned or alarmed about climate compared to, 49% of whites, 57% of blacks, and 70% of Latinx people. So if you do the math on that, knowing that black people are almost 13% of Americans, we're talking about 23 million Americans who can't focus on helping with the climate crisis, even though they already are deeply concerned about it. And that, at the very least, is just a massive waste of intellect that is not going to solving this other existential crisis, because we're asking Black people to deal with two existential crises at the same time. And so that's where my head has been these days, is thinking about how can I continue to work on these challenges in an intertwined way, because they're inseparable, if for no other reason that one distracts us from the other. But there's one other thing that I'll say about this is we know that injustice, lack of equal access to opportunity, where you live has a huge impact on sort of like what you are able to do with your life. And we're starting to see the term climate justice be used more often, because we know that the impacts of storms or sea level rise or droughts or all these other impacts of climate are borne disproportionately by poor people and people of color, not just in the US, but around the world. And so there's a justice issue there. We're seeing that tied to COVID too, because burning fossil fuels obviously leads to air pollution, and most of those polluting facilities are located in poor communities and communities of color, and poor air quality puts you at higher risk for COVID. And so we're seeing that play out in the demographics around the injustice of the way that that disease is affecting, that virus is affecting Americans too. So there's all of these different ways in which these things are intertwined. And I just hope that we can have a more nuanced approach to these issues and not just say, it's a distraction and we shouldn't think about it, but because it's a distraction from solving the problems, we actually can't ignore it.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really important perspective. It would seem at first blush that the problems of ocean health and climate change and justice are completely kind of worlds apart, but they are very interconnected, to your point, and they're interconnected in a way that we can't ignore either. We have to give equal or maybe even more focus on the things that are happening around us, so that we make sure that some of the more longer term problems are actually addressable by the folks that need to address them. So, really important perspective. So, I mean, it's clear to me certainly that climate change and ocean health are complex systems problems, but we have to start somewhere. You've spent a great deal of your time in policy, as well as in the field, working on real tangible problems with people that are impacted. If you could solve one critical problem facing the ocean today, what would it be and why? And why would you start there, I guess?
If I could solve one?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, this is fun. I like having a magic wand. There's one that's actually part of the UN Sustainable Development Goals on the ocean. Goal 14 has a sub goal, which is to eliminate subsidies for fishing. Because basically, it's not a free market, right? Governments are subsidizing overfishing and therefore the collapse of ecosystems and therefore food security. And so that if I could just like wave a magic wand and end subsidies, that would be great. And I could think of some other things we could spend that money on instead, like enforcing marine protected areas, for example. So that would be a fun one. I think people don't often think enough about the financial incentives that are set up against conservation. We may think about how to set up incentives for conservation, but the game is already so rigged, and it's a pain to deal with that because policy change is really hard. But it's also something that corporations like Google have engaged in since the beginning, right? Like you need to make sure that you have a policy context within which your business can thrive. And it's the same thing for all these other elements. Sort of for better and for worse, we need to keep our eye on what are the rules of the game and do they actually need to be changed if we are going to be successful.
That's a really, really important part of the equation is kind of how policy plays into all of these things. There's a lot of, there seems to be sort of a recognition on both sides of the aisle now, with, the current administration putting out their most recent executive order around promoting seafood and aquaculture in the U.S., as well as some of the legislation like the Blue New Deal that Elizabeth Warren put forward that I know you co-wrote. Do you see that there's an opportunity to, and maybe an appetite to revisit some of these policies that might be impeding progress in these areas?
First, I'll say that if you see an environmental executive order out of the Trump administration that looks too good to be true, it might be too good to be true. It might be a way to push overfishing. But the U.S. does actually have one of the best currently fishing management systems in the world because of the Magnuson-Stevens Act. And there's a lot of opportunity to think about the ocean as the blue economy, as it's sometimes called, as a place where we can be supporting employment for coastal communities and figuring out sort of back to this idea of how do we use the ocean without using it up. But I think it's one of the things that I find heartening about working on ocean issues is that they weren't always polarized politically. Ocean conservation was a bipartisan effort until maybe like 10 years ago. Everyone wanted to save the ocean. Like, why would you not want to save the ocean? Like, why would you want a bunch of plastic in the ocean? Don't you want, of course you want fish to be in the ocean, right? And so I think that we still can I think we can get back to that. Like, it's not so far gone. I think, especially when it comes to issues like plastic pollution or protecting coral reefs, you have, Republican members of Congress in Florida who are supporting these kinds of initiatives. And so, yeah, that's when I think about where is there hope for bipartisanship? Like, not directly throwing trash into the ocean constantly is like one of those rare areas that people seem to be like, yeah, that's no good. We should stop doing that. And sort of starting there and expanding out, and thinking, diplomatically about how one thing could lead to the other there, because there's certainly a lot of love for the ocean. Like, I think if we can go back to that as a core motivation, because so many people love beach vacations or snorkeling or scuba diving or surfing or whatever it is. It's this very human thing to care about nature. And so harnessing that, I think, can be really powerful.
Yeah. I'm very happy to see that there's an increased focus, no matter what political affiliation that there is, around ocean and ocean health. But I am worried that this may become an issue that gets politicized. And so I think it's interesting to see that there are some issues within this space that are commonly believed. And I think because of that, it gives me hope that we can actually move things forward in a meaningful way.
It's definitely politicized, but I think it's salvageable more easily than some other issues anyway.
You mentioned something that I want to come back to, which was coastal cities. So you've done a lot of thinking about the future of coastal cities through your work with Urban Ocean Lab. And it's clear that because of all of the challenges facing coastal cities from overfishing or extreme weather events, that it's important that we focus on these areas now. What are some of the ways that you're thinking about the transformation of coastal cities?
Well, I'm thinking about what's transforming coastal cities, and that is climate change. I mean, we have in New York, we're projected to have 1 to 3 meters of sea level rise by the end of this century. So if we think about that as 9 or so feet, it's not all going to come in 2099, right? We need to be thinking about that as a foot a decade. And how is that going to change infrastructure? How is that going to change transportation? How is that going to change buildings? How is that going to change which neighborhoods we live in when we already have sunny day flooding and New York City has, 578 miles of coastline approximately? What does that mean for the value of protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems? Because they can protect us from help to buffer the impacts of storms and also of sea level rise. I think it's really easy to fall into the trap of like innovation and technology in this like high tech sense as being the solution, and engineering. In particular with dealing with sea level, people want to just like build walls and try to hold back the ocean, which I get and is sometimes effective and the best option, but we can't actually hold back the entire ocean. Even in New York City, that would be like 578 miles of wall. And then how high would that have to be? And would that make the city so ugly and fortress-like that we wouldn't want to be here? And so thinking about the opportunity to protect and restore wetlands and mangroves and seagrasses and oyster reefs as a solution that's actually often more cost effective and more effective. The stat that always sticks with me is that New York City, when it was hit by Hurricane Sandy, had already lost about 85% of the wetlands that had originally been in New York. But the 15% remaining helped avoid hundreds of millions of dollars in damages to New York City. So just think if we were actually just a little bit more deliberate about protecting and restoring coastal ecosystems, how valuable that could be to protecting coastal communities. So those are the kinds of things I think about when I think about the future of coastal cities, is that like we're just completely unprepared for what's coming in terms of sea level rise, in terms of storms. But I also don't want to be super negative, because the ocean is actually also a source of really core climate solutions. For example, offshore energy is one of those opportunities where New York City doesn't have or any coastal city doesn't have enough land to put up just like acres and acres of solar panels or wind turbines. Like, we just don't have the open space for it. But the ocean could be a place where we're generating and powering the entire coastlines if we are really thoughtful about how we deploy offshore renewable energy.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a ton of potential. It's just a matter of figuring out the right places to put these things and making sure there's the right support for it. I completely agree. At Tidal, we're aiming to solve some of the ocean's hardest problems with technology, but we're definitely not of the mind that technology is the be all end all in terms of solutions. So definitely understand and recognize that there are other ways, perhaps better ways to solve some of these challenges. But as part of your PhD research, you did design a fish trap with escape slots in the corner that allowed juvenile fish to escape. And that sustainable fish trap design is now mandated in several countries. So you sort of have this experience of
feels like a whole other lifetime. I could have been scuba diving and like hung out with fishermen.
Sounds like an amazing experience. But you've firsthand seen how technology can play a transformative role, and maybe sometimes where technology isn't the solution. Can you think of any other technologies that you've heard of or that you're excited about that may have a pretty good chance of having a tangible impact?
I think I would just go back to renewable energy. We need to transition off fossil fuels basically immediately. And offshore wind is the most unsung opportunity for that. I mean, offshore wind could power all of New England if we actually deployed that at scale. And right now there's only one small wind farm off the coast of the US, off of Rhode Island. There's a lot of others in the process of being developed, in the permitting process. Obviously, there's a lot that we need to consider to get that right in terms of, the habitat of the seafloor in these different locations, not wanting to be in migratory pathways, either for marine life or for birds. I think there's a real opportunity for technology on the mapping side to help us understand and layer all of these different factors, right? So what are the ecological factors, the physical factors, the marine life and avian life factors, the policy frameworks and that we need to think about when we're deciding where do we put things in the ocean. And often that can be a really hard puzzle to crack as a person trying to figure out how to be helpful, or as a company that's trying to deploy some of that stuff. So I think offshore renewable energy, both on the part of actually deploying it, there's a lot of technology that's needed there, and monitoring the ecological impacts, as well as figuring out like how, sort of like where we should be doing these things. The geography of offshore energy, I think, is super interesting.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground and touched on a bunch of different topics. But before we open this up to audience questions, if people want to learn a little bit more about some of the things that you've discussed today, do you have a recommendation for a book or a film or a podcast? Pick your favorite media. Are there any recommendations you have for folks to get more educated on?
I feel like I should just like turn around and look at my bookshelf here. It is like this stack is the ocean stack. It's like mostly old textbooks though, which are like probably not what people are looking for. I guess I would say I can just like go ahead and recommend the book that I'm writing.
Yeah.
I'm writing a book on climate solutions, which will certainly have an oceans focus and be out next year, as well as co-editing an anthology of essays by women climate leaders that's coming out in September. And that I'm really excited about because of the opportunity to highlight this whole chorus of voices of people who are working on ocean solutions, including seaweed, which we didn't talk about. So I'm really glad that came to my mind as answering this question. And it brings me to a book recommendation of a book I am not involved with, but have read and adore, which is called Eat Like a Fish. It's by Bren Smith, who's the founder of Green Wave. And it's his story. It's a wild sort of memoir of his transition from being a commercial fisherman and watching all these fisheries get overfished and collapsed around the US, and then transitioning to working on ocean farming, particularly of seaweed and shellfish, which you don't need to feed, you don't need to water them, they don't need fertilizer, they just grow off of sunlight and the nutrients in the water. So it's one of the most sustainable and low carbon footprint sources of food. And so regenerative ocean farming is what that, or restorative ocean farming is what that emerging field is called, that Bren has been an incredible pioneer of. So Eat Like a Fish by Bren Smith. And then I am launching a podcast in September with Spotify and Gimlet on climate solutions. And because I'm the co-creator and co-host, there will be a solid dose of ocean stuff in there too. So, I think I'm really glad you asked that, because that's the direction in which I've been heading, is how do we talk about these topics and make sure people understand sort of the complexity and nuance and opportunities, moving from thinking about the ocean as simply something that's being impacted by climate change to as a source of solutions when we think of regenerative farming and offshore energy and algal biofuels, and all of these other opportunities to actually look to the ocean as a place where we can still get it right in some ways.
That's amazing. Yeah, I think it's so critical. There's a lot of data and science out there that would get anyone sort of engaged and excited about this, but it's getting that awareness out and making it connect with the folks that really need to hear those messages is critically important. So it sounds like you've got some great work on that space.
I think there's a step obviously beyond awareness, and that is thinking about how we can talk about these issues so that everyone can find their own place in them. Mm-hmm. So that's a real motivation under the work that I do, is thinking about how can everyone find ways to use their skills and apply them to these ocean and climate challenges that we face. Because everyone shouldn't be doing the same thing, right? If you are an engineer, there are different ways that you can contribute than if you are a lawyer or an ecologist or an artist or a journalist, and making sure that everyone who wants to be a part of these solutions can find like a foothold for themselves in that, I think is really important. Because often when we think about activism or conservation, it's like we expect everyone to do the same thing. Like everyone march, everyone sign this petition, everyone call your representative, and everyone vote. Like, yes, do all those things, and everyone sort of do no harm. Also, like eat sustainable seafood and don't throw trash into the ocean, right? But I think there's a deeper layer that we need to start thinking about, which is like, what are your special skills, and then how do those align with the problems that you are most concerned about and the solutions that need to be implemented.
That's a really powerful message. I look forward to reading and watching and our.
Oh, you're living that message, so thank you.
Great. Well, I think it'd be great to go to some audience questions. I know we have quite a few here on our dory. So if you're up for it, we can start with the first one. Which is, how do you think about balancing ocean use with ocean conservation?
I think we need to have a new understanding of what ocean use means when we're in the context of approaching 8 billion people on the planet, right? So I think one of the hardest things to talk about in ocean conservation is the fact that traditions don't scale. The things that people in coastal communities have been doing for generations, for centuries, can't be sustainable anymore in a world where we have, significant climate impacts that have already affected the oceans, and where we just have so many more people. we can't feed 8 billion people with wild seafood. It's just not possible. And so I think making sure we are aware of the new and changing context within which we're trying to use the ocean, and not just say like, well, this is the traditional way, or this is the way it's been done before, but really taking a step back and respectful of the people who depend on the ocean for their livelihoods, for their cultures, for their incomes, that we say, okay, well, like, does that make sense in this new context? And if not, what are some other options? And so that's why I love this idea of regenerative ocean farming, because fishermen are like cowboys, right? They don't want to be farmers. They have a completely different way of seeing the world and interacting with nature. And so instead of saying like, you can't do that anymore, you have to, put pellets into this pen for aquaculture, that's your new job. How do we think about this transition towards a new iteration of living with the ocean in a way that actually makes sense within a sociocultural, economic, political context, which is a lot. But yeah, I think the balance between use and conservation has to be something that we allow to evolve, and that use needs to look different. It's not just taking whatever you want out of the ocean. It's thinking about how we can grow things in the ocean that actually help to heal it, as well as understanding the value of the ocean intact as a way to protect our coastlines, as a way to have, when people are traveling again, have tourism, because all of tropical tourism is essentially dependent on a healthy ocean and healthy shorelines. And so there's a huge value in that. So making sure that we respect those values that are not immediately obvious, because we're thinking more broadly and holistically, I think is a big part of the opportunity there.
Yeah. It seems like it's certainly more challenging in the sense that you can't have one set of rules or policies or things that you're going to implement globally. It's not going to work that way, which makes your approach of engaging communities to really help build out these what works for that community within the context of the culture and the activities that happen there much more powerful. I mean, if we're thinking about creating lasting change, which we all should be, that's really the way to do it. And yes, it might be a little bit slower, but there are probably some general principles that we can take and implement in different ways. But we can almost tailor those, or make them a little bit more specific to the communities in which we implement.
Yeah, on that line of thought, some of the general principles are like, if you kill fewer fish, there will be more fish, right? If we protect ecosystems, they are often very resilient. So one of the, don't pollute. I think one of the initiatives that people are really coalescing around now is this idea of 30 by 30, which means 30% of the ocean should be protected by 2030. And that's something that a lot of nonprofits and governments are trying to get behind as a goal. We missed 20 by 20. Right now, only I think 2.5% of the global ocean is fully protected. And that means like no fishing, no extraction. There's a larger percent that I believe is still single digits, around 10%, that is parts of the ocean that have some sort of restrictions. But just think about that, like 2.5% of the ocean is protected. Clearly that's not enough. And so that's something I think hopefully everyone can get behind, wanting to sort of multiply that number by 10 as soon as possible.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, it appears that there's very, very good reason for protecting the ocean, and yet we're still only at 2%. What do you think are the major barriers to expanding that out, and how can we make things go a little bit faster? A lot of it faster, actually.
There's so many things. One of them is that people are using the ocean, right? And so if we're asking people to stop using the ocean in some places, then it's incumbent upon, the people who are making policy to provide alternatives, which they're often not prepared to do. Also, fishing communities tend to have a really loud political voice, even though they have quite small numbers. There's this sort of nostalgia for the way things used to be, and people want to hold on to that, which I totally understand. But, the context has changed, and so the use and the policies need to evolve as well. I think also politicians are generally not brave. They tend to follow and not lead. So the polling that you see around support for any number of issues is much stronger in the public than it is in terms of the political policies that are being enacted. And so that's certainly true for ocean conservation. The vast majority of people don't want the ocean to be polluted. They want the ocean to be protected. And yet politicians are really pretty wussy on doing these things, even though there is public support. And so making sure that politicians understand just how much support there is for these measures actually really matters, because that will help build political will, especially for issues where there's not a lot of opposition. They just aren't hearing from people that this is a priority for the public. But it's just going really slowly because it's not a top priority, which I can understand in the context of the world that we live in. And there are a lot of different problems, and, there are not a lot of economic opportunities that are alternatives in a lot of places. So I think the science is really clear, and the scientific community has in the last 2 years really coalesced around this goal of 30 by 30 and even protecting 50%. So hopefully, with the science being a more unified voice, that will help accelerate things. Another challenge is the lack of jurisdiction on the high seas, which is 2/3 of our ocean, is beyond areas of national jurisdiction. So our governance on a national level goes out to about 200 miles from shore, or you split the difference with the nearest other country. But there's a lot of the ocean that's past that. So the UN for many years now has been trying to negotiate a treaty for how we would create protected areas on the high seas. And that's something that's hopefully going to go through this year or next. So we'll see if that helps.
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
Spent a lot of time crossing my fingers.
Yeah, no, you and I both. What do you see as maybe some of the major catalysts for behavior change in the ocean conservation space? It's obviously been, I think, one of the things that I'm certainly seeing is there was a very much a focus on the data and the science behind everything. And I think there was a recognition by that community that those messages weren't necessarily all of the doom and gloom stats that we hear all the time. It wasn't resonating with the folks that really needed to hear it. So, I mean, that's one of the kind of trends that I'm seeing sort of shift. Are there other things that you're seeing or things that you think could be sort of a major catalyst for changing the behavior and the engagement around ocean conservation?
Along the lines of what you were just saying, one of the pieces I wrote most recently is about this topic of how do we flip the script of seeing the ocean as victim to hero. Because it really is like saving us from all of the terrible things that we are throwing at it. The ocean has absorbed about 30% of the carbon dioxide that we've emitted. And that's led to ocean acidification as CO2 is absorbed and becomes carbonic acid and then H+ ions. And all of a sudden the pH of the entire ocean has changed. But if it weren't for the ocean, we'd be have an even greater warming problem. And the same with heat. The ocean has actually absorbed 90% of the excess heat we've trapped by burning greenhouse gases. And so just having an appreciation for the fact that the ocean is really saving us from ourselves, I think is an important first step. And then flipping the script and saying the ocean is the source of all of these solutions that we've been ignoring, from offshore energy to protecting our shorelines from storms, if we are protecting coastal ecosystems, to regenerative ocean farming, to algal biofuels. I mean, we really can be thinking about the ocean in this different way, as opposed to like, poor ocean, someone should do something about it. It should be this exciting opportunity to implement solutions, and also thinking about the ocean as a carbon sink that could become an even bigger part if we think about the same way we think about planting trees and restoring forests on land. We could be thinking about the ocean in the same way, with growing seaweed and restoring wetlands and mangroves and seagrass beds. I mean, I remember just learning a few years ago that wetlands could absorb 5 times more carbon in their soils than a forest on land. And seagrass is twice as much as a forest on land. So this idea of blue carbon, I think, is really important, and not overlooking the fact that the ocean can be a massive part of our climate solution if we stop just thinking about it as like the victim of all of the climate impacts.
Yeah, that's really important.
Because it's much more exciting to work on building the world we want to live in than preventing the apocalypse, right? Like, how it doesn't get me out of bed every day to be like, how do I prevent these like worst case scenarios from happening? Like, and we have so much media and science around these projections of like the worst case scenarios. Like, we all know what it looks like if we get it wrong. Like, we've seen the movies, we've read the books, we've read the articles, right? We've seen the graphs. It's like terrible on that end of the spectrum, but we still have this wide spectrum of possible futures. And I know that's what motivates me, is saying, okay, like, how can I help create the world I want to live in? Like, that's what gets me out of bed in the morning. And so I think that reframe can be a really powerful and motivating one.
Yeah, it's almost like using the potential as a catalyst for fixing things almost indirectly, but by virtue of the sort of potential that we're trying to chase. I think that's amazing. I think one of the things we think about at Tidal quite a bit is, how do we enable activities and ocean-based industries to happen, but making sure that they're doing so in a sustainable way. And so one of the things that we always come back to is, it's really hard to understand what's happening under the ocean. And so if we could create a way to monitor and to measure what's happening, then we could actually help some of these, potential solutions that would use the ocean do so in a way that doesn't create habitat destruction that we're just not aware of, because it's really hard to see. And so I think it's really important that as we focus on the potential, that we also focus on ways to measure the impact and measure the benefits and the downsides, so that we can course correct if we need to.
I think the evidence of that hit me the hardest was that in the BP oil spill in the Gulf, the Deepwater Horizon BP spill. Mm-hmm. Once we had a camera down there showing oil gushing into the ocean, the entire conversation changed, because we have this out of sight, out of mind problem with the ocean, as you described, with what's happening beneath the surface. It looks like it's blue on the top. There's still waves, like seems like it's doing okay. But once you have a video camera showing the gushing of oil polluting the ocean, and you can it's not a stretch to guess like that's a bad thing. It's going to impact ecosystems and seafood and beaches and I think the visibility aspect is really key.
Yeah. And setting a baseline, or having a baseline, right? When we see a sea turtle, it's amazing. There's a turtle. Well, what we don't realize is there might have been thousands there, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and now there's one. So I think providing a baseline for what's happening is really going to help us as we move forward to understand how things are evolving, and how we can maybe change the pace of the evolution.
There's a whole field of historical ecology that's based on that, right? And this concept of a shifting baseline, that with each generation of ocean scientists, we just have lowered expectations for what the ocean should look like. That we don't expect as much of coral reefs or sea turtles or kelp forests. We're just like, looks great to me. And so when people go diving for the first time, it's so exciting, and you see like 3 colorful fish and you're like, there's a whole other world underwater and it's magical, when you don't realize that it's basically a ghost town compared to what it used to be. And so that sort of longer term historical data has been really critical to making sure that when we implement policies, that we're actually setting the bar high enough for not just protecting what's left, but actually restoring ecosystems as well.
Absolutely. So there's an interesting question here around, you've done so many things in your career to date. What's something that you're particularly proud of, or something that you're the most proud of?
I think the most recent one is working on the Blue New Deal, because the Green New Deal resolution that was introduced by Senator Markey and Representative Ocasio-Cortez last year, first of all, I recommend that everyone read it, because it's only like 14 pages, double spaced and huge font. Like, it's not a long document. It'll take you 5 minutes. And then I think we as a public can have a more informed conversation about it, because there's a lot of like big, scary sort of talk about what this means, but no one's read it. So go read it. But when I read it, I realized that it mentioned the ocean once in passing on like page 10 as like things we should protect include, right? And I thought, what a missed opportunity to not talk about all the ways the ocean can be a part of addressing the climate crisis. So I collaborated with Brent Smith, who I mentioned, who's a fisherman turned ocean farmer, and with Chad Nelson, who's the CEO of the nonprofit Surfrider, which is Surfrider Foundation is the largest grassroots ocean conservation group in the US. They have chapters all over the place. If you want to get involved in local ocean conservation, that's a great place to start. And so collaborating with them and just envisioning what it would look like if the ocean were a part of the Green New Deal. So we came up with this idea of policy opportunities for a Blue New Deal, which was meant to supplement the Green New Deal. And that became an op-ed, and then it became a policy memo collaborating with a think tank. And then it became, and then Bren asked a question in the CNN Climate Town Hall during the Democratic primary. And Elizabeth Warren was the one the question went to, and he asked, would you support a Blue New Deal? And she immediately saw the value in that. And I was contacted by her policy team to help actually figure out what would those policy elements be. And she released a Blue New Deal plan a month or so later. And the reason that I'm proud of that is because since no other candidate did it, it wasn't like an argument about like whose candidate's ocean plan is better. Although, like, believe me, I would love for us to get to that point. Like, a lot of the better ocean plan, vote for me. But because there was no competition, people who supported all sorts of different candidates were like, we support this idea of including the ocean in the climate conversation. Why not? Like, let's all embrace this policy proposal. And so being able to cut through the noise and promote an idea that gained traction more broadly, that actually didn't get overly politicized, even though it was released by one political campaign, was actually really great. And to see the life that those ideas have taken on the Hill, in Congress, in other campaigns at state and local levels, sort of being able to contribute to reframing the issue and making sure that when people think about climate, they maybe have a greater chance of thinking about the ocean, is something that I'm really proud of and something that I'm continuing to work on.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And when I saw that, I was very, very excited, because it had never been a part of anyone's platform, especially not someone who is so close to the nomination. So I'm hoping that it doesn't end there, and that we one day are discussing at a later date, like whose plan is better than the others. That would be an amazing place to be.
I feel like my job these days is to be like, also the ocean. I care about climate, but like, the ocean is part of the climate system. Like, ocean currents drive air temperatures, like just reminding people about these things. It's like, I feel like a broken record sometimes, but it's not part of the way that we're educated. So it's nobody's fault that they don't know this yet.
Absolutely. So you mentioned a lot of wonderful organizations, whether it's Greenway or Surfrider or your urban ocean lab. Are there other organizations that you can recommend people get involved with if they want to get more engaged in these topics?
I mean, because we've been talking about ocean and climate as being so deeply intertwined, I would say on the climate side of things, anything you do to help address climate change will help the ocean. Sierra Club has been doing absolutely incredible organizing around climate. In particular, their Beyond Coal campaign. So in the last, I'm going to get this wrong, but 5 or 10 years, they've successfully shut down over 200 coal-fired power plants. I believe the number is 232. And there's another few left. So that campaign has been incredibly successful by working with local utility commissions to sort of show that the cost-benefit analysis doesn't make sense to keep running these really polluting fossil fuel facilities. And often the only reason they're still there is because they're subsidized and hiding the cost from the consumers and the communities. So making sure that we keep that effort going and get the U.S. off of coal as soon as possible is one thing. I'm just so inspired by the leadership of Marianne Hitt of that work over at the Sierra Club. Sunrise Movement is a youth organization addressing climate change and really interjecting climate policy into the political discourse in the U.S. right now. They're the reason that the Green New Deal gained a lot of traction. It's an idea that's been floating around, but they picked it up and championed it. So that's another one. Both of these organizations have local chapters in addition to Surfrider. Surfrider has been not only pushing for water quality protections, as well as beach access and preventing really damaging development along the coast, but they've also been helping to fight the construction of fossil fuel pipelines offshore, which is really important. We can't keep building new fossil fuel infrastructure. We need to build a totally different world. And so one of the recent efforts I've been a part of is this idea of a green stimulus. As the U.S. is going to need more and more support from the government in figuring out how do we rebuild our economy after the coronavirus-induced recession and possibly depression. How can we all be encouraging our political representatives to do what we call a green recovery or a green stimulus? How can we use those funds to direct them towards building the future we want to live in and ensuring a habitable planet instead of sort of re-entrenching the fossil fuel hegemony? It's a really big opportunity. It's like a multi-trillion-dollar opportunity to put money behind the future that we need to be building. So that's another really great way for people to engage if they're following that issue.
Yeah, that's a really, really incredibly important point, is that it feels like with COVID, and of course there's a lot of really terrible things that are happening surrounding that the pandemic, but there is an opportunity in a way, because things have stopped, to really rethink how things restart. And I think there is absolutely an opportunity to do it in a more greener and bluer way as we move forward. So I think it's really important that we speak up now and kind of get things moving in the right direction with the folks who can really make this happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, I know we're almost at time. I think we're at time now, but I wanted to just thank you again for taking the time to chat with us. It's such an honor to meet you and to hear your perspectives on these things. And I certainly look forward to continuing the conversation with you. And I know that the folks that we're watching today gained a lot of great ideas as well. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me. Yes, and there's certainly more to come, more to discuss. This is one of the defining issues of our time, and so it's exciting to think about how technologists and innovators and engineers and corporations can be a part of the solution.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.